Amon-Ra St. Brown, Rashee Rice. Guys like that is what we're talking about today in our second half league winners episode. Guys who were first half of the season and are going to explode over the second half of the season. So Ty, why don't you kick us off? Who is your first second half league winner today?
It's George Pickens. Ever since Russell Wilson has come into this offense, his ADOT has jumped from an average of 11.9 with a low of 9 yards even to 15.1 with a low of 12.9, I believe. That being said, again, Russ has been a positive change for this Pittsburgh offense. They're actually pushing the ball downfield more, which fits into Pickens' game. On the year, though, Pickens is 8th in target share of all wide receivers this year. He's 13th in targets per route run, 3rd in red zone targets. So this is not what you think of in Pittsburgh of an offense that wants to just run the ball in and score that way. They're willing to mix it up, and they're willing to get their guys some targets, specifically George Pickens. You look at the rest of the season schedule for Pickens too. He gets each divisional opponent twice, and he mixes in Washington and Philly. So it's not the most ideal schedule. There are some very tough matchups. There may be some games where it is going to be a ground and pound kind of game between the two teams. But when you get 28% of your team's targets in a not so high volume passing offense, I don't really care. Like, you are still going to get targeted. Admittedly, this could all change if Pittsburgh does go trade for another receiver. There were reports that they were in on Christian Kirk. They were always connected with Brandon Ayuk before he decided to stay with San Francisco. So if there is a new receiver on this team, it does alter things a little bit. But as things stand, if Pickens is the only wide receiver that Russ is, or the only high caliber wide receiver in that wide receiver room, Pickens is going to come through still this year.
Yeah, and it feels like when we're talking about a trade, there's not that many names out there that are available that we would see Pittsburgh pick up that would knock Pickens off from being the wide receiver one. Like you said, maybe they chip into the target share a little bit, but even then, this wide receiver room is so thin to begin with. So there's a reason Pickens has seen 28% of his team's targets. We could see that continue to climb even the rest of the season with the way that connection looks between him and Russ. I know when Russ came in that first couple of games, everyone was like, what are you doing? Right? They were 4-2 or whatever, 4-2, 5-2. I don't remember which one, but they were playing well with Fields. But Russ has kind of unlocked a new level to this team. They're able to move the ball down the field, like you said, and the guy who's going to benefit from the most from that is George Pickens. So I can't believe I'm saying it, but I do agree that down the stretch, George Pickens is a guy you're going to want on your team because consistency might actually be a big part of the rest of the season for him because he's seen the volume, which is just surprising from what we've seen over his career. My guy is a little different. I'm transitioning to a rookie now, talking about Mr. Rome Odunze. And I know a lot of you know me as a DJ Moore guy. And I think DJ Moore's been awesome over the past, season and a half. I think that Rome Odunze is going to make a big push in this offense to be the at least 1B and maybe even overtake DJ Moore as the 1A in this offense. So far on the season, he leads the team in ADOT, average depth of target. He leads the team in yards per route run. He's been playing between 75 and 88% of snaps when all three wide receivers are healthy. That was the worry coming into the season. What it was that he was going to get the short end of the stick with Shane Waldron, but they're keeping him out there. They're playing a lot of 11 personnel. His target share has been only about 18%, but his air yard share is 30% of the targets, or is 30% for the team. So they're using him downfield. He's getting the big plays. He's being explosive, high efficiency targets for fantasy football. And he's top 15 in unrealized air yards right now, which is pretty impressive for a guy who's only got, 44 targets on the year. But that's the way they're using him as him and Caleb continue to mature over the rest of the season. That's why I brought up Rashee Rice. That's why I brought up Amon-Ra St. Brown. Am I saying that all of a sudden Rome Odunze is going to be 20 points a game, 17 points a game like those two were? Maybe not that great, but we could see over the second half of the year as both those guys take a step forward, a big jump for him. And a big part of it too, I put this on a TikTok that I made last week about DJ Moore being a league winner. This is the same reason Rome Odunze could also be in that same boat, is the rest of the season schedule. They see New England, Green Bay, Minnesota, Detroit, San Francisco, Minnesota, Detroit, Seattle, which from an NFL standpoint is a gauntlet to finish the season. You get Green Bay, Minnesota twice, Detroit twice, San Francisco, and Seattle. That's a tough way to try to make the playoffs. But from a wide receiver perspective in fantasy, Minnesota and Detroit are both top 3 in points allowed to wide receivers. Seattle and New England are both top 12. So he's got a lot of good matchups coming down at the end of the season. I think Rome is going to take a real big step forward, and I think you can get him dirt cheap. If not, I think there's leagues out there where he's on the waivers right now.
There's always a rookie. I shouldn't say always. Let me just start this whole thought over. Over the last couple of years, we have seen a rookie wide receiver step up in the second half of the season because the speed of the game they are up to speed with the speed of the NFL. They're on they're finally on the same page with their quarterback. Again, we saw it with Amon-Ra St. Brown. We saw it with Rashee Rice last year. Rome Odunze definitely can join that kind of company, not just from a talent perspective, but again, from this fantasy perspective of like, hey, there could be a jump here. Now, I do want to acknowledge that this Chicago offense has been way too inconsistent this year, where the highs are pretty solid and pretty good. The lows are very low. And according to Rich Rebar, the highest inaccurate target rates for players with 25 plus targets this year, Rome, Keenan, and DJ Moore all ranked top 10. Rome is actually the highest of the three at 22.7. So essentially the risk in what you're hoping for with an investment on Rome is that this Chicago offense not only figures it out, becomes more consistent, but that Caleb actually is getting more accurate, better targets to his guys. That being said, though, it's not like Rome is on the outside looking in. It's not that he's not being involved in the game plan or anything. This is just, hey, if one or two pieces kind of fall into place here, Rome Odunze can absolutely hit big. So I like Odunze. Again, there is nothing wrong with taking the shot on these rookie wide receivers after the halfway point of the season, because sometimes the payoff can be absolutely massive.
Yeah, and then we've seen that too over the last couple of weeks. His yards per route run has increased every single week over the last 5, 6, and 7 targets since coming off the bye. So I really like Rome Odunze. Ty, you're taking a chance here. You're going out on a limb for this guy, and I don't blame you because I want to too. I wasn't strong enough to say it, so I'll give you your space to talk about your second half league winner here.
Not exactly a rookie receiver, but as a sophomore receiver, it's Jaxon Smith and Njigba. And you can say it's recency bias after his wide receiver 1 performance on Sunday. Again, curiosity may kill the cat on this one, but all I'm going to say is that there's an opportunity for JSN to absolutely pop off in the second half of the season. According to Matt Harmon of Reception Perception and Next Gen Stats, JSN caught 3 of 5 20-plus air yard targets on Sunday. He only had 5 total the first 8 weeks of the season, and there were no games with multiple deep receptions for JSN. And again, in week 9, that all changed. According to maybe further explain just how good of a week it could have been for JSN, Ian Hartitz of Matthew Berry's Fantasy Life also tweeted out that JSN had a gains of 38 and 40 yards that were wiped out by holding calls. So he could have gone over 200. Not saying that's going to happen every single week. Not going to say that JSN is going to be a downfield guy exclusively now for the rest of the year in this Seattle offense. But if Ryan Grubb in this passing attack continues to do right with DK Metcalf kind of comes back into the mold where like, hey, DK is not just the downfield guy. They're going to mix in JSN to do the same thing. Cam and I were talking about this before we started recording. Similar to what the Rams do with Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua. They play very similar roles, but you never know which one is going to be the one on the specific play, right? If you can get that with JSN in this Seattle offense, he can absolutely cook in the home stretch of the season. And he gets teams like Arizona, Green Bay, Minnesota. 2 of those teams come in the fantasy playoffs. So again, if he hits, if this past week, what we saw in terms of the utilization of JSN sticks, oh boy, JSN could legitimately be a top 15 wide receiver than the rest of the season.
Yeah. The issue with JSN, I think right now is, like I said, a lot of these guys are buys. JSN's a hard one to buy right now because you're buying off the 37-point game.
Correct.
But at the same time, just because a player is hard to buy does not mean he can't be a league winner, right? That I think that's the two different things of if you can get him from a guy who's just like, you know what, I think I'm selling him for what I, can get right now. This is the best I can get. I'm still getting him cheap. Then yeah, I would go buy him. But if somebody's like, hey, I'm selling him as a top 12 wide receiver because this is the second big game we've seen from him so far this year, then I don't know if that's worth the risk, right? Because that's what you're hoping to get out of him, versus like what his range of outcomes, like you said, Ty. He's got what we've seen so far, all the way up to maybe he does push top 12 for the rest of the season if we see them actually use him how he should be used on the NFL field. But with that being said, I'm a huge JSN guy, and it's just felt we've seen those flashes game after game. One-handed catches, just great over-the-shoulder catches. When they use him in space, he makes people miss. If we can just convince the Seattle offense and Ryan Grubb to keep this up, like you said, a little Puka Nacua, DK Metcalf action. Obviously, these two are very different wide receivers, but if they're running similar routes, if you're using them all over the field, JSN's got the skill to be a top-level wide receiver moving forward. All right, with that being said, we're going to take a quick break and hear from our friends over at Underdog Fantasy.
Today's podcast episode is brought to you by our friends over at Underdog Fantasy. Now, we love Underdog. It is the easiest place to play best ball formats, and they even have their own form of player props called Pick 'em. You can make up to 20 times your money on a single night by correlating props together. 2 picks will triple your money, 3 will 6 times it, 4 will 10 times it, and 5 plays that all hit will multiply your entry by 20. You can even place insurance on your picks too, so if only 4 of your 5 props hit, you still get 10 times your entry. And if you use our code FELLAS when signing up, Underdog is going to double your first deposit up to $100.
We are back, and we got 3 more players. And Ty, I'm getting down and nasty with these last 2. I'll admit it with my last 2. Your guy's a little more, I think, of a softball down the middle for you, but I still like the name. I'm just giving you a little crap. My 2, I'm going to start with Jakobi Meyers, and I think he's the bigger name of the 2. So if that gives you any insight into who my last guy is, but Jakobi Meyers has been the wide receiver 21, not wide receiver 2, wide receiver 21 in points per game since Davante Adams left with the injury back in week 4. He's averaging over 9 targets and 70 yards per game during that stretch. On the season, he's seen a 25% target share with 33% of red zone targets so far. So we've been seeing him be used all over the field. We saw this last year too. I don't know if you, especially in the beginning of the year, remember back, but there was a lot of worries about Davante Adams because Jakobi Meyers had multiple games in a row where he was out targeting him. And we saw from Davante Adams this last game against Houston, he's not like cooked or anything. Davante Adams still got it. He's still beating corners one-on-one, making catches. So for the fact that Jakobi Meyers was challenging him for targets gets me a little bit excited. Luke Getsy, their offense coordinator, was just fired. Now, that doesn't mean all of a sudden they're going to be pass happy or anything. If anything, they're probably going to run the ball a little bit more, or at least want to. But I think it's just a little bit of mix-up, maybe gives this team a little bit of a jolt. Not quite the same jolt we saw when they got Antonio Pierce last season, but maybe just enough of a jolt where we can kind of see them, figuring some stuff out on the offensive side of the ball. His playoff schedule is Tampa Bay, Atlanta, Jacksonville, New Orleans. That very pass friendly. something we're going to want to see. So I just think the volume is going to continue to be there, even with Brock Bowers getting his. I think Jakobi Meyers is going to be ready to go. I think he's going to have an awesome rest of the season. And yeah, I'm all in on Jakobi Meyers over the back half of the year.
This is probably the grossest name that we'll talk about today. But I was thinking about this as someone that ultimately won a league, or at least placed highly in my league, because I bought in on a guy like Myles Gaskin when Miami was not where they were, where they are right now.
Mm-hmm.
But I just said, hey, even if he's going to give me 13, 13 feels a little gracious even. If he's going to give me 11 or 12 on a week, I've got enough upside guys on my team that I don't need a Jakobi Meyers to shoot for the stars and all those kind of things every single week. Meyers is going to stay on this pace right now, like you said, where he's getting these 8-9 targets a game, because besides Brock Bowers, there's no one else. Run game isn't working right now. The only way they can move the ball is through the air. So that's just going to benefit Meyers even more. Again, the schedule is there too. It's not a super sexy name by any means, but sometimes you do just need to say like, okay, I know that Deontay Johnson is probably the better talent at wide receiver, and I know that he's in Baltimore, but he's going to be fighting over a passing, or he's going to be fighting for targets in a passing game that is totally contentious, throwing the ball 25 times a game. So he's battling three other guys versus a guy like Jakobi Meyers, and maybe even like a Walmart version of Pickens, in the sense of like, there's no one else. Okay. So his target share is going to remain high no matter what happens with this team. So again, if you were just looking for a nice, like, steady Addy piece, Jakobi Meyers is definitely going to be your guy.
Yeah, no, and since week 3, averaging 16 fantasy points per game. I just want to read you the list of guys who are averaging less points per game during that stretch. A.J. Brown. Diggs was before he got hurt. Brian Thomas. Zay Flowers. DK Metcalf. Devonta Smith. Jaden Reed. Mike Evans. I'm not saying that he keeps that up rest of the season. I'm just saying that to show, hey, this guy's been good. And I think it's going to continue because he, like you said, he's the guy that they need. He's one of the only guys they can throw the ball to. He's one of the only guys they can move the ball down the field with. So yeah, I'm okay leaning on Jakobi Meyers as a wide receiver, low-end wide receiver 2 rest of the season. Ty, I'll give you your last guy. You can't argue with this name. I think it's a phenomenal name. I'm so happy he's on this list. So I'll let you take it away.
David Montgomery might just be like, he is probably the biggest name that we're talking about today. But the thing is, he's not going away in this Detroit offense. He's going to be used on the goal line, on early downs, and he's been very, very good with the touches that he gets as well. I really don't think I need to dive into a whole bunch of stats, because it feels like everyone knows who David Montgomery is and what David Montgomery does. But the only selling point that I can give you right about David Montgomery is the fact that this Detroit offense is probably the best offense in the entire league outside of Baltimore. And it's really it's a debate between those two teams. Montgomery is going to continue being involved in this run game. He's going to continue, again, like I said, early downs and goal line. That's his bread and butter. If he mixes in, sprinkles in, I should say, like 2 catches a game for 20 yards, sweet. You'll take that too. And you look at the schedule the rest of the year. Houston, Jacksonville, Indy, Chicago, Green Bay, Buffalo, Chicago, San Francisco, Minnesota. I'll take that Minnesota game out because that's week 18. And if you play fantasy playoffs into week 18, I'm sorry. You need to talk to your commissioner right now and be like, hey, people sit in week 18. We should not have their championship weeks on week 18. Back to the point, though, about Montgomery. All of those except for maybe 1, maybe 2. Like Houston, probably a tougher matchup. Chicago also has a decent little run game, but they got literally shredded by Arizona, so I don't know what to think about Chicago anymore. At the same time, I don't think it really matters how tough the opponent is for Detroit, because Detroit's going to play their style. That means getting David Montgomery, double-digit carries, sprinkle in a couple receptions, mixes in a couple touchdowns. awesome. David Montgomery, again, a guy that you don't traditionally associate with a high ceiling. If he pops on certain weeks, especially like in fantasy playoffs, the dude is going to really make a difference on your fantasy team then.
Yeah, I mean, we're looking at a guy who's had one game under double digits in PPR formats. His second lowest game is 12 fantasy points. Fantastic floor if he ends up finding the end zone twice in a week, which, like you said, on this Detroit offense, not out of the question. Is, he's a vital piece of this offense. They're going to continue to use him, and really, I mean, except for maybe Houston, but they haven't exactly looked great. Buffalo and maybe San Francisco. Those are the only three games that they're not going to be able to just run the ball the entire time. And Buffalo's doesn't have a run defense, so they're probably going to try and run the ball the entire time at Buffalo. But that's just what they do. That's who they are. If you've watched Dan Campbell at all in an interview, that's all he wants to do is play defense and run the ball. And so, yeah, I agree 100% with David Montgomery. I think he's probably going to continue to average 15, 16 fantasy points a game as he pushes 100 yards and a touchdown every single week. My last guy, we got to give a little props to Lucas. I hate doing this when he's not on the episode, but his start of the week this week was pretty good at the running back position. It was Chase Brown, and he's the guy that I'm talking about. We gave him crap for it, Ty. We really did. We thought, that's kind of gross. But Chase Brown looked really good. And 27 attempts, 5 targets on 80% of snaps. Obviously, it helps that Zach Moss was out. However, Zach Moss is supposed to be out indefinitely with a neck injury. And if we know anything about running backs and neck injuries, that's not a good sign for coming back throughout the season, right? I mean, we hope Zach Moss returns. We hope, he gets healed up. We hope he figures it out. But when you hear out indefinitely, neck injury, running back position, hopes aren't exactly high that he's returning quickly, if at all, for the rest of the season. Their schedule moving forward is, middle of the pack. But the one thing we know about Zach Taylor in this offense is he's willing to give his running back a ton of volume. If you remember the Joe Mixon years, a couple of years, last few years, it wasn't always pretty for Mixon. I mean, we're talking 3.9 yards per carry, 4.2 yards per carry, 4.3 yards per carry. And Zach Taylor continued to give him 270-ish carries, continued to give him 70-ish targets. And that's kind of what we saw from Chase Brown yesterday, right? He was efficient. He looked good, but they just kept feeding him the ball. And he's on an offense in the Bengals who've put up the 5th most points in the season. So him finding the end zone is not going to be, a worry as maybe it would have been last year with this Bengals team. So I don't know. I unfortunately think Lucas was right. I think Chase Brown's about to go on a little bit of a heater here as he is the only back in this offense.
Chase Brown, ever since taking over this backfield, has just looked like the guy that should have been the guy from the get-go. Mm-hmm. So admittedly, us calling him, special teams Chase Brown, probably we can't call him that anymore at this point. He's been the running back 17 in usage ever since taking the backfield. And some of the names that are above him right now, or again, above him in usage since week 6, Tony Pollard, Alexander Madison, Ramondre Stevenson, like those are running backs on bad offenses, and you're going to just get terribly inconsistent, weeks from those guys. So you can sit there and be like, well, I'm going to get the guy that's guaranteed to get touches in their offenses. Sure. But what Chase Brown provides that those guys don't necessarily can give you every single week on a week to week basis, receiving work, good offense. Like Chase Brown is, I don't want to call him the Myles Gaskin of this year, but it's a low named running back that not a lot of people are going to have a ton of stock in. They don't think it's going to be as steady as it has been for the guy. It definitely is, because again, in good matchups, he's going to get the ball. In bad matchups, he's going to get the ball, but he gets high value touches. That's what ultimately matters. And in a good offense, he's going to get those in bunches. So again, a name you don't think of as a league winner for 2024, 2025, but you can't really deny when you look at his situation. You can't really deny it.
It honestly feels like Devin Singletary from last year for me, where it's
Correct.
just gross
Yes.
and you don't want to believe it, but he's on a team that's putting up points and he's going to get the volume. And, I just think that's just what we're going to see from him rest of the season. And like you said, you're not going to have to give up a lot for Chase Brown right now, just because even if people saw that game last week, it's still like, it's Chase Brown, right? It's not like, you're not excited about it by any means. But that wraps up our second half league winners. Hopefully we brought you 6 guys that you can either go trade, or if you're there on your team, you have confidence now to stick with them, to start them. If, maybe a guy like Rome is on your waiver wire because people are just like, I'm just sick of this, you can go scoop him up. But these are 6 guys that we're putting our faith in. We're standing behind for the rest of the season. So make sure that you go scoop them up or you're starting them. But tomorrow we will have more buys and sells for you. Maybe not league winners, but guys that we are still believing in. We'll have 4 buys, 4 sells, me and Ty. Lucas will be back on Wednesday as we do our 24 starts and sits of the week, as these starts and sits are getting absolutely crucial. Some leagues only have 4 weeks left until playoffs. So you definitely don't want to lose one down the stretch. But if you want to follow us on the socials, I'm at CamelFFF on the X, at Tyler_Plath for Tyler. Fantasy Football Fellas on YouTube, TikTok, and Facebook. Fantasy Football Fellas Shorts on YouTube if you want the short film over there. The FFL is on Instagram, and FFL is on the X. But that'll wrap up for us today. We hope you enjoyed our little shorter of an episode for a Tuesday, but that's all right. And hopefully these guys, like I said, have said multiple times, will help you win your league. But that's all from us, and we will see you again tomorrow. Deuces.
Deuces.